Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Sarah Otai, and I'm here to welcome you to the Center for Coastal Studies Climate Change Working Group. So we're located in the United States, in Cape Cod, at the very tip of the Cape, in the state of Massachusetts. So we are sticking way out into the Atlantic, on the Western Atlantic. And I have known Angelina for a few years through my associations with her at UC Davis. She and I have been buddies for a while. She's an excellent speaker, very knowledgeable. She's an expert on international and Russian climate and environmental policies. She's an environmental and climate journalist, regularly contributing to Russian and international media. She also teaches at a number of universities in Russia and has been an observer with the UN climate negotiations since 2008. She graduated from the St. Petersburg State University of Economics and Finances in 2000, when she probably was about 12, and completed a number of international educational and professional development programs, including the Thomas Reuters Foundation Program at Oxford University, City of Hamburg's Young Leaders Internship Program, where I met her with the Beers Environmental Leadership Program at UC Berkeley in California, and as a Humphrey Fellow at UC Davis. She's a member of the Global Reference Group, Bread for the World Development and Relief Agency of Protestant Churches of Germany. And she's been a member of the World Future Council since October 2020. And since March of 2022, Angelina has been a fellow at Media in Cooperation and Transition in Berlin. And we're very grateful that she has found a place to land and that she's with us here today.
Thank you so much for this, Sarah. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It is indeed a great honor for me to be speaking in front of such audience. And I very warmly remember our time together at UC Davis, Sarah, and also the way you took us to the university nature reserve system and showed us around. Those were indeed very special days. Unfortunately, and here I would probably like to start with a personal story, a story through which I've been living throughout the last 2.5 months, and throughout also many of us have been living and experiencing and observing happening. The story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the story of destruction in Ukraine, but also destruction of many lives of people in Ukraine and in Russia. Many people in Russia who are against the war, political activists, NGO people from the non-governmental sector, oppositional leaders, and also journalists had to leave the country. And I was one of those people, and I left country in mid-March. I went first to Turkey, and then I went to Germany, and I'm currently in Berlin. And those are indeed very sad times of our lives and of the life of humankind. As someone who was still born during the Cold War, I never thought I would live through something like this, but unfortunately, this is our reality now. Now, the main topic of my presentation now are environmental and climate impacts of the war in Ukraine, and probably very important to say in the beginning is that we obviously see country being destroyed, many regions of Ukraine being destroyed, people dying, people having to flee to Europe and other parts of the world. But it's also that we see many nature systems also being destroyed, and biodiversity, ecosystems, and various direct and indirect environmental impact, and also impact on the global climate system taking place. Now, I've been trying to monitor these effects and this impact for the last few weeks. And I have a few articles in English and in Russian coming out in the next weeks. And I'll make sure I'll circulate these materials with you, Sarah, so that you could pass it along to your colleagues and also whoever was and is present today for the lecture. I'll also share my presentation now, and the presentation will be publicly available. And in the presentation, there are also quite a few links to further suggested reading, which I've collected. Most of this reading will be in English. However, I've also included a number of what I think to be useful resources in Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian, especially if those are visual resources. Quite a lot of information on environmental destruction and environmental impact is already being available in English, as I mentioned, but many more still not. So I'm trying to gather all this information, process all this information, and then also share all this information with the wide international audience, just like we do it tonight. So I'll start sharing my presentation now, and I'll try to stick to half an hour as we agreed to. Actually, I had so many thoughts and so much information. That was quite a challenging task, but I still hope we will succeed with sticking to the time frame. Now, environmental and climate impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. So these are the topics I'm going to talk about throughout my presentation today. And I thought I would concentrate on three major areas. So the first area is direct and indirect environmental impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. And then also impact of the war on global climate agenda, where we are now, and what are the main challenges resulting from the war and resulting from invasion on global and also local climate policies and actions. And finally, I'll also give a very brief overview of what has been happening with regard to Russia's environmental and climate policies. Russia remains to be one of the main emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. It's the fifth largest world emitter after China, the US, the European Union, India. So Russia comes number 5, and it's obviously very important, very relevant what will be happening in the country with regard to climate and environmental agenda. And I'll try to touch this question very briefly. So if we start speaking about environmental impact, I've identified a number of direct consequences of the war actions and of the invasion in Ukraine. Now, most of this consequence, most of this impact is something which we observe or can observe on the territory of Ukraine. So most of the direct environmental consequences are to be found and to be identified where the immediate war is taking place, or where the military action is actually taking place. And you see here that consequences vary from immediate pollution, soil, water, air pollution, and some pollutants, some toxic pollutants from weapons, but also from destruction of housing, of infrastructure, can remain in earth and ecosystems for tens of years, if not hundreds of years. This is obviously a very important issue. And here I would like to attract your attention to one Dutch organization, which is called PAX. And I will just show you one of the work that they're doing. So that organization is specializing in monitoring immediate environmental pollution in areas where military conflicts are taking place. They work all over the world. They also work now in Ukraine. And I've spoken to one of their experts a few weeks ago. Actually, I also run an environmental podcast. And in my presentation, you'll also find a link to this environmental podcast. And we spoke to one of the experts from this organization about the work they're doing now and the research they're trying to do now. So from use of various kinds of weapons in the country at this very moment. So their work is certainly very important. So just PAX, an NGO based in Holland, which is trying to monitor all the negative impacts of the war in Ukraine at this very particular moment. And but it's quite obvious that the consequences and also the direct consequences of the war in Ukraine, they're not limited only to that kind of pollution. Military actions means also that energy supply is being disrupted, nuclear accidents or other, like we would not use the word catastrophe here probably, but I would say what nuclear accidents might happen. And in the materials which I provide to you, there will also be a few overviews of recent very dangerous situations around two nuclear power stations in Ukraine. Luckily, until now, nothing serious has happened, but it's still important to monitor what has been happening. And you will hear and you will see quite a lot of Ukrainian and Russian experts on nuclear safety speaking about what is happening now. The war also means destruction of water infrastructure, and that is dangerous in many respects. One of these respects is obviously a question of immediate water security and people having less access to drinking water, but that also has very long-term consequences, especially when water treatment plants are being destroyed and there are a lot of chemicals pouring out. So destruction of water infrastructure, especially urban water infrastructure in very high densely populated areas or areas which used to be very densely populated is indeed a very bad story. Now there's also ecosystems destruction and threats to biodiversities. War means death and direct threats to lives of people, but also direct threats and lives to wildlife, animals living in wilderness, animals living in zoos, animals living in shelters. Unfortunately, it is the reality with which Ukraine is being faced now. And finally, because some of the military actions are also taking place on sea, and we also have quite a high level of marine pollution. Unfortunately, most of data on marine pollution, especially with regard to the Black Sea, is still found only in Russian language. And one of the materials which I would provide for further reading, there's a very good analysis of it. Also with, for example, with the recent case of destruction of a ship called Moscow or Moskva, there was very little information available. However, some Russian and Ukrainian environmentalists have tried to put out a map of possible pollution. And yeah, as I said, it's all still in Russian at the moment, but maybe you will still find this materials useful. Now, those were the direct environmental consequences of the war, the ones I could identify. We might see more appearing, but at the moment, I would put them into the 6 main categories. Now, there are also a number of indirect environmental and climate consequences of the war, which are to be seen and which are to be observed not only on the territory of Ukraine, but also globally, and which are to be thought about and considered by every one of us. It's something which we can all see, experience, and it also shows like a war or a military conflict in one particular region of the world might have many indirect consequences elsewhere, from South America to Asia. Well, the first obvious question is a question of energy security. Russia has been, still is a very important provider of fossil fuels, including natural gas, oil, and coal to many countries of the world. And now with more and more countries declaring embargoes on Russian oil and gas, the question is what comes instead, and how does those embargoes change global energy systems? The really big question now is obviously the European Union, which has been the main buyer of natural gas from Russia and oil from Russia. There are talks going on about the oil embargo, and a number of countries have already announced oil embargoes on Russian oil, including the US, including the UK, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, the Czech Republic. A number of further countries are considering also putting a natural gas embargo on natural gas coming from Russia. However, for some larger buyers of natural gas from Russia, including Germany, including Italy, including Hungary, this is still a very important decision, which might not be possible in the near future. So the question here now is what those fossil fuels will be replaced with. Would that be LNG coming from other regions of the world, including the US, For example, Germany is currently building 2 LNG terminals in the north of the country in order to be able to accept more LNG coming from the US. Will it be more renewable energy coming into place? All these questions are still open. There are a number of large infrastructure projects in place, including the LNG terminals, which I already mentioned. But then I believe the whole war and the whole military conflict, and with Russia being one of the main players in fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel market in the last few years, also demonstrates us how global energy system is vulnerable to such events, and how global energy markets, which are relying on just a handful of countries for deliveries of oil and natural gas, may find themselves in a very sensitive situation to disruptions in such deliveries. And that also something which gives us a lot of food for thought. What is the future of energy? Do we still want to rely on just a few suppliers of oil and gas, or can we change our energy system so that it can be more equally distributed, and more equity and also more energy security can be brought into the markets? Those are indeed the questions which are being discussed at the moment by governments, by experts, by companies, and also by people just living in many places across the world. Now, the second question, which has also been very much present in the news, is the topic of food security. Russia and Ukraine have been and very important providers of wheat and a number of other food like grain resources and a number of other grains, but also fertilizers for many countries of the world, with North Africa, the Gulf countries, and also some other African countries being the main buyers. And so now we see great turmoil in the food market, especially in the wheat market and the fertilizers market at the moment. So we see some countries declaring bans on export of wheat, some other countries considering expanding the areas of where they grow wheat, and some countries also thinking of increasing their production of fertilizers. And those decisions, they will have long-standing consequences for many years to come. So just to give a few examples, I've been in very intense, and I've been in very close interaction with a number of sustainability experts from Brazil in the last few weeks. And the stories which are coming from Brazil and also partly Argentina is that both countries are considering to increase their production of food. Argentina is thinking of producing more wheat, and Brazil is also thinking of producing more fertilizers, mainly from potassium. And a lot of this production, a lot of this new production will also be connected to further desertification and further cutting down of rainforest in Brazil and other kinds of forest and ecosystems in Argentina. And this is also a very big question: how can we balance between the two? So the whole balance between the global need for resources, including food, and then regional need for economic development, social development, and global concerns and global need for ecosystems to be preserved or conserved, all the questions are becoming as urgent as never before. And this war just highlights it, and this war just makes it more urgent than, and more seen and more heard than, once again, ever before. Another example, which I also mentioned at this place, it became known just yesterday, and I think already quite a few articles appeared in international media. The Ukrainian National Seed Bank, so Bank of Plant Genes in Kharkiv, has been destroyed. Once again, Ukraine being a very important international agricultural producer, that means a lot of disruptions in agricultural produce and agricultural markets are to come. That means, unfortunately, very bad news for food security in Ukraine, but also not only in Ukraine, but also globally. Now, further environmental and climate consequences also obviously include further disruptions in supply chains of various products, of various resources. And this is something which is currently being monitored and analyzed by quite a number of international think tanks and research centers. I would like to draw your attention to one such project, which also actually went online just yesterday. And you probably know there is an organization which is actually based in it's based in California, in San Francisco, and this organization is called Global Footprint Network. They are the ones who've been following the international biocapacity and also biocapacity and resource capacity in various parts of the world and various parts of the various countries. And they're the ones who usually declare, well, let us see, it's the World Overshoot Day, like Earth Overshoot Day, say on August 19th, when we globally used all of the resources which we had. So just a couple of days ago, they used this new resource, which I also very much encourage you to study, which is trying to look at the global resource situation in connection to the war in Ukraine, and also trying to calculate ecological footprint of the war in Ukraine. And there's quite a lot of data available on various resources, from crops to metals. And there's a lot of data here. I actually just started looking at this data today because, as I said, it only came out a couple of days ago. And this is once again is trying to show us a bigger picture. What happens in a world where deliveries of resources coming from Ukraine is limited because of the war and disruptions in production of these resources. But what also happens in the global trade and in resource chains and resource flows because of the situation in Russia as well, and many countries not willing to buy all of these resources from Russia anymore. So I highly encourage you to take a look at it. I highly encourage you, this is also among the links which I share in the presentation. I highly encourage you to take a look at this resource. So it's a Global Footprint Network, and they're trying to accumulate quite a lot of data and look at global consequences of the war in Ukraine. Now, another indirect consequence, which, however, has a lot of global importance and importance for the global community, and is very much connected to the global scientific and research communities, is obviously a question of scientific cooperation and access to scientific data. As you probably have heard, quite a lot of international universities and other academic institutions have ceased their cooperation with Russian academic institutions, Russian state-funded academic institutions, and some of them even stopped cooperation with Russian scholars, or scholars from Russia. And so the question now is what kind of disruptions in scientific cooperation, but also access to scientific data will that mean? As we all know, Russia is the largest country in terms of area in the world, and there are various kinds of ecosystems in Russia, from the Arctic to the steppes. And we might experience significant shortage of scientific data about various effects of, for example, climate change. What happens in the Russian Arctic with regard to climate change? What about permafrost research? Most of international cooperation projects, and there have been some very intense, also US-Russian cooperation projects in the area, or German-Russian cooperation project in the area. A number of environmental labs studying the melting of permafrost or studying migration of species because of permafrost. All these projects are on hold now. And it's becoming very complicated for international researchers to come to Russia now and do research and get data, but it's also becoming more difficult for Russian academic institutions to exchange their data with international data banks and scientific libraries, and also scientific hubs of scientific data. And that is obviously a very important challenge. It's all very recent. It's all very new. This is why we still don't know all the unintended consequences, whether it will remain like this for long. At the moment, as we still find ourselves in the middle of actual war happening, actual military action happening, it's hard to predict when the war will end and with which result it will end. But sooner or later, we will find ourselves in a post-war situation. And then the question will come back again. What sort of scientific cooperation will it be possible? What sort of exchange of environmental data will it be possible? And how much can such programs be resumed again, including global academic institutions cooperating with Russian academic institutions? So we'll have to see. We'll have to see. Also, with regard to the as I said, consequences of climate change. If we think about permafrost, if we think about Arctic, Russia does remain a key player in these areas, also in terms of economic cooperation and scientific cooperation. Now, if we switch more specifically towards the climate agenda, there's also been a lot of discussions going on in the last 2.5 months. It's obvious that now war being the news #1 all over media, all over the world, it suddenly pushed climate agenda a bit back. And even in late February, another IPCC report came, which outlined particular risks for particular regions and also need for adaptation for particular region. However, it got much less coverage than it would have otherwise, unfortunately. With so much interest and so much concern and so many fears connected with what's happening in Russia and in Ukraine now, the interest and the attention towards climate agenda is unfortunately going down. We hope it will not be for long. And as I said earlier, we will find ourselves in a post-war situation one day. And climate change is also here. It's not going anywhere. We see more extreme consequences of climate change with unprecedented temperatures now in parts of Asia, parts of Central Asia, parts of Middle East, with forest fires and wildfires already beginning in Russia. They began already more than a month ago, and many Siberian cities and regions experiencing unprecedented heat. And so there are vast territories and vast areas already burning, and many cities are already in smoke. So climate change is still here. And also, if we hear less about it, and if our attention is drawn more towards other topics, it still doesn't mean that climate change is not there. That's a very important task, and that's a very important challenge for many of us. We're also trying to communicate climate change in one way or another. And obviously, I've already mentioned a number of consequences for the global energy market and for the global energy balance. Now, there's been a very useful report coming from the International Energy Agency just last week, and I also wanted to draw your attention to it. I also included into the suggested reading materials, which I share after this lecture. And so here's a report. The report is quite long. I mean, the International Energy Agency usually produces reports which are quite long, 200-300 pages. And in this report, like if I look through it, and so the basic trend is which we experience now, current disruptions and in the fossil fuel supplies, including oil and gas embargoes, will have both short-term and long-term consequences on the energy market. And among the consequences, in various parts of the world, we can see such consequences as, for example, a rise in use of coal, which is obviously not good for the energy, for the climate story. In some other parts of the world, a rise in use of LNG, liquefied natural gas, because there'll be less demand for natural gas coming from Russia via pipelines. In some other parts of the world, there'll be more interest going back to nuclear energy, because nuclear energy is usually something which is locally accessible and also something which can be used more for confirming and for sustaining energy security within the regional frame and within the regional or country-based scale. And however, it does not mean that the whole energy transition agenda is of our interest and of global agenda. So even all these short-term trends, they still do not cancel global trend towards further development of renewable energy and further investment into renewable energy. In fact, this report draws a rather positive picture. It says that the 2022, this year, we're going to see a lot of new capacity coming in renewable energy, and there'll be more investment because renewable energy, as well as I said earlier, with a number of other energy sources, it's also a kind of energy which secures our local energy production and sustains energy security in our country, in our region, or even in our community. So a whole idea of, do we really want to go away from the system where fossil fuels are being delivered just by a handful of countries and come back to and come or towards more decentralized system of energy generation and energy transition? It's as urgent as never before. So even the International Energy Agency, in short term, but much more longer in the long term, sees very good prospects for renewable energy development. In 2022, according to this report, most of investment will be done in the European Union and in China. It should also be noted here that with so many European buyers and also Western buyers turning away from Russian oil and gas, Russia has a lot of hopes that other countries and other parts of the world, including China and India, will be buying more oil and gas from Russia. Now, oil is more or less relatively flexible market, one can say, in terms of oil deliveries. Oil is mostly delivered with tankers. However, here the question will be again where the tankers will be coming from, who will provide the insurance, whether international insurance companies will still be willing to insure tankers which will be bringing Russian oil also to new Asian markets. All these questions are open. And it's also that India and China are willing to buy more Russian oil, but they are willing to buy cheaper, much cheaper than many Western buyers. And for natural gas infrastructure, while if we don't speak about LNG, liquefied natural gas, we speak about gas pipelines, and gas pipelines take years to build. So it's a very long story. You cannot build a pipeline overnight. And we also obviously see a story how the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which took many years to build and negotiate, is now standing empty and will probably not be used at all. There's actually, right now in Germany, there's a very interesting debate whether it's actually also environmentally damaging to keep it as it is, whether it will rust, whether some plastic part of the pipeline will actually end up in as marine plastic, as microplastic in the sea. And and also who is supposed to take care of it? Should it be dismantled or should it be left as it is? This is once again another global and local environmental impact of the war in Ukraine, even though it takes place somewhere quite far away from the actual military actions. I realize we don't have that much time left, so I'll probably just quickly wrap up the everything which I still had to show and I wanted to share with you. And also another very important issue connected with the global energy transition, global climate agenda, is the need for metals. And there's been a very interesting study coming from the Leuven University in Holland. And it's also included in the materials, how many more materials will be needed by the European Union, but also globally if the world is aiming at full decarbonization by 2050. And you'll see huge numbers of demand for metals varying from nickel and copper to like basic metals like aluminum. We need more metals. And both Russia and Ukraine being large producers of metal and various kinds of metals to the global markets, that obviously puts another question, what can be done if the world we need more metals? where do we get them from? So the answer from that study would be that we need more recycling of metals and better principles of circular economy to be integrated into the whole metal sector, but also other sectors which are using metals. This will probably be another very important trend: energy efficiency, resource efficiency, metal efficiency by all the sectors of the economy which are using metals. So how can we track metals? How can we recycle metals? How can we use more recycled metals as we need more and more of them on our way to energy transition and on our way to full decarbonization? Now, a few very brief words about what has been happening in Russia with regard to the climate and environmental agenda. And here, once again, the story is unraveling as we speak. The story is unraveling the way as I follow it happening and as I write and tell various audiences about this. So to put it short, quite a lot of environmental legislation, environmental standards, environmental certification has been rolled back in Russia. From the introduction of the best available technologies to state environmental expertise, to regulation for cars and other vehicles. A lot of this legislation and certification is just being rolled back, because now what stands out as the main priority are social and economic development questions. And also with many foreign investors and many foreign technologies leaving Russia, it's becoming more and more challenging to actually to stick to these standards. And this is obviously a very bad story. We also see a lot of relaxation of the legislation on construction rules and also rules for construction in nature protected areas. A number of Russian environmental groups, including the Greenpeace, which still works in Russia, are trying to fight these new changes and new reforms. However, they're also taking place. So unfortunately, we see this. Russia officially says it's still on board with the Paris Agreement, and it still has not canceled any of the climate targets, even though the climate targets has been somewhat not very ambitious. We'll see how that story develops, and we'll also have to see what the official rhetoric and what the official words mean. So far, I mean, nothing changes, but then we see what the actual real actions will be. A number of Russian businesses, including oil businesses, have been pushing for easing of, say, for example, reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and also, for example, the need to verify this reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. Also, interestingly, Russia now finds itself in a very peculiar situation when there's an abundance of oil and oil products in the country, so because they cannot be sold elsewhere. So Russian oil companies are pushing, for example, for more oil and oil products to be used within the country, also within energy generation, and, for example, suggesting that a lot of power generation facilities, which would use natural gas in recent years, will be switched back to heavy oil, which is not good environmental and climate story. And there's also been a lot of stories how oil companies are pushing back on legislation which would require them to capture gas which comes out or flaring gas, which comes out at oil wells. And in recent years, there's actually been some progress with Russian oil companies burning less of flaring gas. However, now they demand that these rules be eased again, and that would allow them to release and to burn even more flaring gas. Because what has been happening in the last few years, that flaring gas was captured and it was produced into kinds of plastic and sold to the European Union. Now it's not happening anymore. And another very big question is, what will the companies do? What will be their reaction? So far, once again, in words, all companies remain committed to their climate and to the environment goals. And ESG in general has been a very important topic for many Russian companies, especially the ones who are very much connected to export industries, including fossil fuels, including metals, fertilizers, and many other wood companies. Now, with more and more limitations for exports, the question is really, would these companies still stick to their promises? And also, if many of them go and reorient their exports towards other markets, including Asian markets or markets in the Middle East or Latin America, would that still be required? For like a very concrete example, FSC, the forest certification organization, has left Russia, and they've called back all their certificates for Russian wood. And now the question is whether wood companies and wood processing companies would stick still to sustainable forestry. Once again, that has been the topic which has had some modest development in Russia in the last few years. So now it's under a big question. The future is really unclear. I'll probably stop here. So this is a link to my Twitter, where I post everything what I do, what I write, and where I speak. And there's also a link to the podcast, which we do with the colleagues from Berlin, London, and Paris. It's an English language postcard. It's called the Eurasian Climate Brief, and we're trying to cover various aspects of climate and environmental policies, actions, and human interest stories in the region of Eurasia. So that would be the post-Soviet region, including Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So yeah, get subscribed and spread the word.